Today we are talking about Xionghui. And no, we are not talking about an upcoming skin for him that everyone's been asking for. We are talking about Xionghui with a basic attack focused build. Not necessarily Xionghui as an ADC, but rather just Xionghui with basic attacks as his primary source of damage. The thought of this is something that has been toyed around with for ages basically, due to the fact that his 3 gives an additional 50% of his basic attack power, and it also double procs pretty much any item effect that is on hit. Similar to Erlang Shen's dog, it simply counts as a second basic attack and can therefore be very useful in that regard. But until now, Xionghui still hasn't worked all too well as a basic attack focused character, as the competition in that role is relatively high and there are a lot of items that he doesn't have the same benefit from or the same access to as others, and that kinda hinders him. His kit, while facilitating certain aspects of playing a basic attack focused character, also isn't entirely designed to help being a basic attacker and being squishy, as you don't really have an escape like other ADCs especially, and also their magical equivalents do. But I wanted to have fun with this and I wanted to see how far I can really push it, if there's any way that I can make this viable and useful. You'll see in the background that I tried out various things across many games, fixed up some things here and there, changed builds here and there, and tried to just go for the ideal route both build-wise and ability-wise. As for the abilities, I thought that it might make sense to go for an order where you max the 1 first and then the 3, as it will set up for additional basic attacks better and also does a decent amount of damage that way. The longer CC could have been something that could be really valuable, but I realized over time that for me it wasn't really working. I instead decided to go for the more standard 1, 2, 3 priority, outside the old obviously, which I prioritized whenever it was available, as in that way you can still get more range damage early in the game. You get more safe damage and obviously the sustain along with it too. So by using the 1-2 combo, which you use more often, and having the 3 as a safety, you will get, in my opinion, much further as Xionghui early on. And your build won't be ready for heavy damage from basic attacks at that point anyways. That comes later, and by that point you're probably level 20 anyway, so you will have everything maxed out. So for me the overall leveling priority was 4, 1, 2, 3. Build-wise, I initially tried to transition from a mage damage build more and more into a basic attack build over time. As I played him jungle, because if you go crazy you might as well go all crazy, I had to start with Assassin's Blessing, otherwise I probably would have started with Hunter's Blessing just to get some extra early attack speed. Then afterwards, the first item that I tried finishing was Warlock's Staff. That, honestly, as a jungler is always annoying in the first place, but outside of that also didn't really feel like the way to go for ADC. You get a bit more health, you're a bit more tanky in that regard obviously, and you get a bit more power, but it doesn't really get the job done for you when you really want to maximize your damage output and also be able to sustain against other ADCs. Sure, you still have your 2 to heal up, but overall I felt like Lifesteal would be the better choice for that in the long run. As for boots, I initially chose cooldown reduction boots, as afterwards I would go into Spear of the Magus. That, for a normal build, obviously makes sense for Xionghui. He stacks Spear of the Magus very quickly, and CDR boots are kind of fine as long as you have Spear of the Magus for the penetration anyways. Now, I had to realize that for an ADC style build or a basic attack style build, that simply wouldn't work. You can't really fit Spear of the Magus into the build all too well, as you don't really have anything else that you could sacrifice for it. The other items are mostly relatively mandatory, if not completely mandatory. And therefore the CDR boot strat also doesn't really work out because you won't be building flat pen too early on. So in the long run I decided to go with a start of Bancrofts and pen boots instead. That way I would have the penetration earlier and I could then focus on the basic attack items, and I would still get a large amount of power while also having that lifesteal and extra power when I lose health through Bancrofts. The third item in the build was actually Shaman's Ring. Shaman's Ring is the one that you could theoretically replace for Spear of the Magus if you really wanted, but overall felt that Shaman's Ring would be more beneficial in the build for me, as it comes with a lot more power and the damage increase on top, which in most situations should result in more damage output overall. And as we have other things that scale with the power as well, that's obviously very helpful too. By building Shaman's Ring this early, you can ensure that the stacks will get filled up in time for you to get the passive with the extra 10% damage. As this lasts 5 seconds after an ability, it's also absolutely fine for Xingqiu, as this amplifies the basic attack, so you're gonna start with your 1 in an engage most of the time, and then afterwards you just spam away with the basics and get the extra damage. The next item then depends a bit on the situation, either Telekind's Ring or Demonic Grip. Demonic Grip if the enemy team is building very tanky already and you just need to get through that magical defense. It comes with a relatively cheap price tag, 2,150 gold, and it also gives you a little bit more attack speed. It gives you 30% in total, when Telekind's Ring gives you 20% attack speed. So overall I would favor Demonic Grip, obviously only makes sense when the enemy team is building any magical defense at this point. There's also the option to go into Hastened Ring first, which kind of can make sense because it's a fun item and it helps out with the early trading, but that can only really be done when there's no magical defense on the enemy team, but you also don't really have the time to save up for Telekind's just yet. The huge benefit of Telekind's is that Xingqiu can proc it twice with his book. That's an extra 20% power scaling plus 20 damage on every basic attack. Something that should definitely not be underestimated, and we'll see in a moment what that results in. The last item that you haven't built at this point could then either be Hastened Ring, or it could also be Toxic Blade. Toxic Blade, again, an item that got buffed very recently, now with 30% attack speed as well, and it also comes with some movement speed along with that, so that is very nice too. That means when you have finished these items, you can trade out your boots as well. So if you haven't built Hastened Ring yet or Toxic Blade, you just build the other one instead of boots, because pretty much every item in your build except for the first one has movement speed on it anyways. You can also consider, if that's not your style, to go into a Gem of Isolation in order to get a little bit more power and to slow enemies a little bit more while you chase them down. Can be a pretty nasty strat, I would say, a very annoying one at least, but probably not as effective as Toxic Blade as long as there are any enemy healers, because again, also Toxic Blade is something that will be stacked per basic attack, meaning Xingqiu should stack it instantly. Now, what does this all result in damage-wise? When you have a full build here and you've traded out your boots, then that's a total attack speed before any extra buffs of 1.94. The total power is 405. The basic attack damage per basic is 144. That leads to a total of 279 DPS. Now we have to keep in mind that there's additional damage for Xingqiu though, 3 different instances. One is his book, giving him another 50% of his basic attack damage, so another 72. Then there's also Telekind's Ring, which with both of the hits combined will do an extra 101 damage. Putting that all together, a single basic attack deals 317 damage. Multiplying that with the attack speed, we come to a total of 615 DPS. That is before penetration, but you also have Demonic Grip as well as the penetration from Pen Boots and Toxic Blade, so you should at least be able to deal with most targets decently. That's actually an overall okay-ish outcome in terms of DPS. We could compare this with, for example, a Carnunos with a Pen build and including an Odibo along with that, who would have 579 DPS before the Odysseus bow bounces. Doesn't mean that the build is better though. Carnunos build is significantly cheaper. After all, you still have to trade out your boots in late game and you still have a more expensive build overall. So the difference in gold here will be more than 1000 extra gold for Xingqiu. Also keep in mind that especially crit builds can reach significantly higher DPS values. The build overall has pretty good mobility as you are relatively fast, but you're super prone to CC and burst damage as you still have a complete lack of escapes otherwise and you don't have the tanky items that Xingqiu normally has. And I found that to be a massive issue in my games that made it pretty much impossible to play him effectively. The only way I could imagine Xiangqui ADC effectively working, or this build style effectively working, was with a full team of setup for him, with tons of CC and very CC heavy frontliners especially, so that he could get his damage off without being targeted, and he would also have to have the right defensive relics. At the same time, the build also isn't cheap, and it comes online super late into the game for the purpose of being a basic attack build. The power curve isn't absolutely terrible, as Xiangqui's base values are also decent, but it just can't compete with the higher tier ADC builds, which are just completely optimized and just bring you more DPS overall and perform more consistent throughout the game. Is attack speed Xiangqui with a ton of movement speed fun? Absolutely. Is he more viable now? Still not really, but I can still recommend giving him a shot. Probably wouldn't recommend doing jungle though I'm not really sure where you would want to fit him anyways, because he's really neither of the classic roles in Conquest at the moment at least. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you're new to the channel, please sub and maybe the bell. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.